Turns out Richard Sever came to Cold Spring Harbor the same year that Bo returned to Cold Spring Harbor. After Richard received his undergraduate at Oxford in biochemistry, he moved to one of our sister institutions, to the LMB in Cambridge, to do his PhD. Then he decided that his calling is in editorial work. And so he first was an editor at Current Opinions in Cell Biology, and then at TIBS, Trends in Biochemical Sciences, and then served as the executive editor of the Journal of Cell Science. But then in 2008, came to Cold Spring Harbor Press as the assistant director of the press. Richard has many hats. He's the executive editor of Cold Spring Harbor Perspectives and Cold Spring Harbor Protocol journals. He launched the Journal of Molecular Case Studies from Cold Spring Harbor, and is the co-founder of the preprint servers that I'm sure you're very well familiar with, which are bioRxiv and medRxiv, and I think he will tell us more about that. He's very active on Twitter. He has lots of followers, very lively discussions, so I recommend that you check it out.
Hi. Get my screen up. I guess you can all see that.
Yep.
So thanks very much for the opportunity to talk. I'm having a problem moving my slides along. Right. So the first thing I wanted to do was just echo a point that Ron made, that the Cold Spring Harbor, obviously, as well as being a research institute, has a very long history of scientific communication. I often joke that we have hundreds of scientists, thousands of visitors, and millions of readers. Most of you will be familiar with the books that the lab publishes, like the Molecular Cloning Manual and journals like Genes in Development. But a lot of our attention over the past few years has been focused on preprint servers. And the reason for this is that to try to get around the problem of traditional publication delays. This is a phenomenon that will be familiar to everyone here. And this is a slide I show to the students here at Cold Spring Harbor every year. And basically, I won't go through it in detail, but essentially, I just want to make the point that when you submit to a journal, typically you go through multiple rounds of rejection, revision, and refereeing, all of which delay the dissemination of the work. And then when that work is disseminated, in most cases, the paper sits behind a paywall, so only certain people can read it. And the question is, in the age of the web, whether we should do things differently. And I think we would argue that you should. And the thing to do is to decouple the dissemination of the work from its subsequent evaluation as by a journal by first posting a manuscript as a preprint, an unpublished manuscript that has yet to go through that sort of peer review certification process. And there's obviously a precedent for this. Millions of physicists have been doing it for nearly 30 years. Archive is hosted at Cornell and has basically been doing this in physics, computational science, and math for, as I said, nearly 30 years. So inspired by Archive, in 2013, we launched bioRxiv at Cold Spring Harbor Lab. It's focused on the biological sciences. It's a non-profit like Archive, funded by Cold Spring Harbor Lab and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. It's all completely free. And the idea was to complement Archive, but with some additional features that would make preprints appeal to biologists. And what's been very interesting is after launching that in 2013, it was followed by a slew of largely discipline-specific non-profit servers in many other fields like chemistry, agriculture, and earth sciences and sociology. So it's obviously an idea that a lot of people liked. And we ourselves last year, in collaboration with BMJ and Yale University, launched medRxiv, a preprint server for medicine. And we're often asked, why a new server? Why didn't we put the content in bioRxiv? And the reason is that there are additional concerns about clinical information, which means the screening process needs to be a little bit more thorough. There are additional declarations and ethics checks that need to be made. So we felt a separate stream for clinical preprints made sense. So why do this as an author? What are the benefits? Well, as I said, I think the main benefit is rapid transmission of results. Posting a preprint puts the author in control of the timing of dissemination rather than the randomness of peer review. The author is absolutely in control of when the information is made public. It's also an opportunity for authors to get feedback on their results, to improve the paper before it goes to a journal. And there are many, many examples now of people who said posting the preprint was incredibly valuable. They got great feedback, improved the paper, and then it had an easier time when it did go to a journal. It's also very, very good for early career scientists to give them visibility, because if you're on some kind of fellowship that lasts about 3 years and you're treading water itself for 18 months to 2 years, it's quite easy to see that those timelines are pretty much incompatible. So if you can get your paper out as a preprint, you can really demonstrate recent work and make it available to tenure committees, grant agencies, and hiring committees. And so there are examples now, like Nikolai Slavov at Northeastern, who actually got his tenure track position from work. He posted a preprint on bioRxiv, and the paper that came out from it in Cell Reports came out after he'd actually got the job. So this is just to make the point quantitatively about the time saving. So if you look at the blue plot here, what it shows is the average times from submission to publication for journals in PubMed. And you'll see that the median there is about 6 or 7 months, but the range goes out beyond 2 years. And, you know, I mean, everybody's familiar with papers that sit around and take a long, long time to be published. And if you compare it to bioRxiv, sort of right over there on the far left, that's a dissemination within 24 to 48 hours. And this is what it means to an individual researcher. So this is a timeline from Mike Fagan, who many at Cold Spring Harbor will remember. He was a postdoc at Cold Spring Harbor. He now has his own group upstate. But he describes a timeline of his recent research. Midway through 2017, he discovered a preprint posted on bioRxiv via Twitter. He got in touch with the author of that paper. They began to talk about collaborating to do some follow-on work based on that paper. Fall of 2017, they started resource sharing, model development, and actually doing experiments. That proceeded through fall, and into January, they actually started harvesting cells and doing DNA analysis. And basically, so Mike had done all his follow-on work by January. In January of that year, the paper that he first read about in June as a preprint was finally published in a journal. So essentially, Mike had a 7-month head start on his work. Now, that's really important for a tenure track individual. I remember when I was at LMB, the joke always used to be that they give you 5 years to turn water into wine. So if you've only got 5 years, then 7 months is a significant head start. But from a sort of systemic point of view, if you think about all those time savings of 7 months, and a lot of the time it will be more than that, there's a possibility for us to really enable scientific discovery in this way. And indeed, Steve Quake at the BioHub in San Francisco has shown that if you do some back-of-envelope calculations about, you know, how many ideas it takes to move a field forward and what the delay imposed by publication is, you can quickly get to an estimate that in 10 years you could speed up science 5-fold if everybody were to disseminate research with preprints. So how does it work? So this is essentially our process. An author submits a paper. It comes into bioRxiv. It undergoes some administrative checks to check for plagiarism automatically, etc. Check it looks like it's a paper. It then goes into a pool where a large bunch of PIs can look at the paper and basically say, this looks like science to me. This looks like a research paper. It's critical to emphasize this is not peer review. It's just a way of filtering out stuff that's pseudoscience, nonsense, or potentially dangerous. When a paper does go online, this is what it looks like. The author gets to choose the article type. They can define it as a new result, but we also provide a home for reproducibility studies by allowing confirmatory and contradictory results, which are often something that journals are not particularly interested in. The manuscript gets a DOI, so it can be cited. It's date stamped, so that's a priority determining signal. Obviously, you can see here that the download link to the PDF, and the author gets to choose the subject area, cell biology, molecular biology, neuroscience, etc. So this is just makes the point that what you're getting that comes down is the author's manuscript, the author's original PDF. There's no typesetting, but we do convert all manuscripts to full text HTML, so you can see inline figures. This is better for text mining, and also it's easier to view on mobile devices. A big difference between journal articles and preprints is that preprints, you can have multiple revisions. So if you look at the history tab on bioRxiv, you'll see a history of all the versions of the article. You can go back to any prior versions that the author posted. And we also have a revision summary where authors can say what is new about the new version of the paper. And obviously readers can use that to inform whether or not they want to read the new version. We also provide metrics. Authors like to know how many times the paper's been downloaded. Those are article level metrics. We have alt metrics, which give links and numbers for the numbers of times that a paper has appeared in the news, it's been tweeted, talked about on Facebook, which is, it's useful in some cases for a measure of, a broader measure of impact. As I said, we want preprints to stimulate discussion and feedback. We have on-site commenting below every paper, but we also aggregate links to discussions that are happening on the web elsewhere. We have a rolling Twitter stream, links to blogs that discuss the paper, and links to a growing number of dedicated preprint discussion sites, some of which I'll mention a bit later. And then finally, when an article is finally published in a journal, we automatically add a link to the paper saying, this has now been published. Here is a link to the journal. You can go and read the version of record of the journal. As I said, the papers are citable, and one of the things that we do is we embed in the DOI the day, month, and year that it was published, so that you can quickly see from a reference the timing of that original submission. The bioRxiv and medRxiv are indexed by a number of discovery services, such as Google Scholar, probably most prominently, but also a growing generation of new search technologies like Meta, Semantic Scholar, and Archivist, which rank papers and push things of interest to readers. How are we doing this is the growth curve for bioRxiv over 7 years. If you look at the black curve is the total number of papers, we just tipped 100,000. And you can see from the dark bars, that's submissions per month. We're getting about 3,500 per month at the moment, and the lighter bars are revisions. On medRxiv, there's an interesting growth curve. Remember, we started this just last year, and actually for the last half of last year, the growth curve for medRxiv looked similar to the early days of bioRxiv 7 years ago. And then something happened in January of 2020. I don't need to tell you what that was. It was the emergence of COVID-19, at which point medRxiv exploded. And we found that we were getting, by March and April, almost as many papers on medRxiv as bioRxiv. This was meaning we were dealing with hundreds of papers per day, and the majority on medRxiv were COVID-19 papers. So as I said, 100,000 papers on bioRxiv to date, more than 12,000 on medRxiv. Consistently, about 30% of papers are revised on bioRxiv, which is interesting. The height of the pandemic so far, we've been seeing 30 million views of bioRxiv and medRxiv per month. And an interesting figure is that more than 70 papers go on to be published in journals. That's calculated from bioRxiv. You want to give it a lag of about 2 years before calculating that number, because at any given time, a lot of papers will still be in revision at journals. But it looks like it's a little more than 70%, which is pretty much consistent with what Archive found. When we think of the cultural progress that's been made in the past 7 years, it's immense. More biologists are posting, reading, and citing preprints. Almost every basic science journal will now allow you to post a preprint. That wasn't the case 7 years ago. It certainly is now. Funders are allowing citing preprints in grants. You can include them in the NIH BioSketch. That was a real significant incentive for people to start posting. And we're seeing hiring committees encouraging people to put preprints in applications. I just saw that Rockefeller had been doing this recently. And a nice thing is that it seems to have bucked the trend for people presenting older data in meetings, because people can post a preprint, put a mark in sand, so to speak. So a lot of people have commented that they're seeing more recent data presented at meetings because people post preprints around the same time. One of the things that we want to do, other than just get research out early, is stimulate evolution of the scholarly communication system. We like to think of bioRxiv and medRxiv as hubs. the hubs for discovery through tools like Google and Meta that I mentioned, places where conversation about research can happen that we aggregate, a place for discussions of reproducibility and the ability to post repetitions of experiments, and obviously the traditional process of certification by journals and newer tools. So journal integration is probably the most obvious thing we do in that respect. We now interact with, I think, about 200 journals that participate in these technologies we've developed called J2B, Journal to bioRxiv, and B2J, bioRxiv to journal. And basically this allows authors to send papers automatically from bioRxiv to a journal once they've posted a preprint. So it saves them the hassle of reloading all the files and re-entering all the information. So I think there's about 160 journals that do that. A smaller group participate in J2B, so eLife, EMBO, and a number of other journals. When you submit to that journal, you can just tick a box that says, do you want to put your paper on bioRxiv immediately? And authors really like this because it saves them a lot of time. Another collaboration we have with journals is what we call transparent review in preprint. And this is where we use the hypothesis annotation technology that is essentially a web overlay to allow journals to post peer reviews of papers they're considering alongside the preprint on bioRxiv. So this is an example here, and the critical thing to point out here, the decoupling is preserved because on the left-hand side, you see the bioRxiv preprint, and the right-hand pane that's peer reviews, in this case from eLife, is entirely separate and controlled by eLife, if not part of bioRxiv. So it's interesting to think where this goes, and I think we're going to see this decoupling promote real innovation in peer review. We're already seeing things like portable peer review initiatives from an organization called PCI, and more recently Review Commons, which is an ASAP Bio EMBO collaboration. Prelights is a great site from the company of biologists, which is essentially a news and views for preprints. Pre-review is a site that allows young investigators to learn how to do peer review. And all these are ways in which people can sort of formally talk about papers that are preprints hosted on bioRxiv or medRxiv. It's been interesting to see a lot of self-organized communities emerging in the light of COVID-19. So University of Oxford, Johns Hopkins, and Mount Sinai have all created groups to discuss medRxiv preprints, specifically COVID-19. MIT has gone a step further, creating RRC19, which is a new journal whose express intent is to peer review and discuss COVID-19 preprints that appeared on bioRxiv and medRxiv. So I think it's interesting to think what this is going to mean further downstream for evolution of peer review. And I think it means that we can think about it in a way where peer review becomes a broader thing that doesn't just happen at one moment in time. Journals will review articles. We have these review platforms emerging, commenting, and automated analyses of text, so-called badging agencies. And I think we can think about it as a number of sequential and parallel events that occur around the preprint that give us additional signals of trust about that preprint. And as molecular biologists, I think we might want to think of these as post-transcriptional modifications. And just to emphasize why we need to do this, why we need to continue to think about peer review, I think never more than now is it more evident that we need to signal the trustworthiness of science. And I would encourage people to look at this article in PNAS that Marcia McNutt, Vera Nakima, Kathleen Hall-Jameson and I wrote about ways in which we can apply additional signals of trust to scientific information that give people more confidence in them. So finally, I just wanted to thank everybody involved. It's often people think that running a website like this is pretty easy. You just run a website, but actually it's involved a large number of people who've worked incredibly hard. I guess in the in-house team, first and foremost, John, who's my co-founder on bioRxiv and medRxiv, and now executive director. So he's the guy with for where the buck starts and the buck stops, so to speak. But there's a large number of people involved who've been working incredibly hard, particularly in the face of the COVID-19 epidemic. Our collaborators, Zhao, Harlan, Theo, and Claire at Yale and BMJ have been fantastic co-founders of the medRxiv server. We've had fantastic support from the lab as a whole. Bruce has really backed us from the word go. Yeah, it wasn't an idea that everybody thought was great initially, but Bruce has been fantastic, as well as a number of people from other divisions, and many of the lab faculty are among our affiliate group. Chan-Zuckerberg Initiative have been fantastic. They aren't just writing checks for us. The partnership with Corey Bargman and her colleague Dario has been absolutely fantastic. It's a real partnership. Similarly, we have great tech relationships with Highwire Press in the Bay Area, Google, and Hypothesis I mentioned. We collaborate with a whole bunch of journals. Just highlight here, PLOS, Amber, and eLife. And of course, the ASAP Bio initiative that Ron founded, Jessica and Rep have been great at really helping get the message out about preprints. And perhaps more than anybody, I should point out that you probably can't see all these, but we have a large number, 200 affiliates across the two servers who vet these preprints, and the service couldn't function without them. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Richard. That was a great talk. Really impressive services that you told us about. So there are a lot of questions, as I expected. So let's start with this one. There obviously has to be a balance between the speed of getting work out and then also making sure that that work is high quality. Is there a way, or how do you have any comments on sort of distinguishing between high and low quality research that gets submitted as preprints? Is there a way to screen against, quote unquote, bad work?
Well, so I guess I would sort of just disagree slightly there. I think there's our view is that we're not discriminating quality. If you see something, there's a caveat with every preprint, which is, this is a scientific paper. What bioRxiv is doing is screening to check that it's probably a scientific paper and that it's not dangerous. The quality is for you as an investigator to judge. So there are undoubtedly very low quality papers there, and there are high quality papers there. And I think that's where we talk about the where peer review and evolving forms of peer review need to take place. bioRxiv's mission is to get the work out quickly, so that people can make that judgment. But we do have, I should emphasize, we do have screening, but the aim of screening is not to judge the quality of the paper, but just to ensure that it's something that really is science and is not dangerous. So we wouldn't post a paper that said, smoking doesn't cause cancer.
Right. Great, thanks. So let's move on to a somewhat related question from an audience member, Rashmi Banerjee. Rashmi, if you're there, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? I'm going to go ahead and ask Rashmi's question. So Rashmi wants to know can all the articles be published in these preprint servers, or is there a specific criteria that are analyzed by experts that determine which article can be published?
No, I mean, I guess what we, if it's basic science and it's not dangerous, then and it's not unethical, then pretty much it can be posted. Our screening process is looking for things that it has to be a research article. This isn't a place for opinion and commentary. It's dissemination of research. It has to be not published. It's not a place for dumping old stuff, and it can't be dangerous. So, like I said, we will turn away papers that could be public health risks. Sure. But other than that, there are no criteria so long as they're biology or in the case of medRxiv clinical medicine. In clinical medicine, there are some additional screening criteria there related to how ethics decisions around the work. Like, if you can't put something that has a picture of a patient or has somebody's social security number, and there are various ethical considerations, but that's somewhat detached from the quality decision. I think the key point to make is that we aren't making decisions about quality.
Sure. So let's move on to a question from audience member Lou Scheffer. Lou, if you're there, you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask.
Yeah, okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. First of all, I really like bioRxiv. It's a wonderful idea and ecosystem, but I've had some problems with it, which is if you try to present a paper that says this is where we are and this is the way we should proceed, it gets rejected as not being researchy enough. Therefore, I was quite surprised to see the example you used, which looked like it was exactly in this class. The one that said genetic information, this is where we are and this is how we should proceed. How are these decisions made?
So yeah, I mean that example is quite an old one. I mean, basically the idea is that we want to present research that has research data or mathematical modeling, those types of things. The issue is that there is essentially a thin end of a very long wedge once you start getting into things that are opinion and commentary. So our basic rule is it's not a place for opinion or commentary. That is valid, but that should be in other places. I mean, for example, criticism of other work, there is a site called Pub here, especially for that. The noise to signal ratio in opinion and commentary is vastly different than in primary research. So we focus on the latter. And so, I mean, I'm a big fan of review articles and hypothesis articles. I just don't think bioRxiv is the place for them. And actually, one of the things that we've seen is we were a little uncomfortable with some of these decisions in the early days, but actually the experience of COVID-19 has shown that really probably was the right decision to make, because, you know, we are inundated with people who have opinions of how things might work. And, you know, for every kind of great opinion or decision or review article that somebody like yourself might write, there will be 25 crazy people who write really weird stuff. And if we post the decent ones, they will argue, why aren't you posting my hypothesis and my opinion? So it's really, it's a pragmatic approach to answering that question.
So since you brought up COVID, we also have a question from an audience member, Reeteka Sood. Reeteka, are you there? Do you want to unmute yourself and ask? Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to ask, there's a lot of reports where preprints make into mainstream media news stories. I mean, for scientists, there is benefit of getting your work out, but then there's also this flip side of it's reported as the way peer-reviewed papers are reported and the way preprints are reported. It's pretty much the same. I wonder what your views on that. What pros and cons do you think are of this?
Well, it's interesting. So somebody asked Ed Yong at The Atlantic about this, and I thought he gave a great answer. And he said, we just had a talk from Bo that was not peer reviewed. There's public information and journalists become interested in this type of thing. But what Ed said was, he said, if I see a preprint and it looks interesting and people are talking about it, then what I will do is I will call up 3 or 4 experts in the area to say, you know, what do you think of this preprint? Should I cover it? You know, other things to worry about. And then I make an informed decision and cover it responsibly. And then he said, and that's exactly what I do if it's a journal article as well. I mean, I think the mistake we make is to create a sort of false, imagine that the system is binary in some way, and that you know, all peer review papers are fine. What's been interesting with COVID-19 is when you think of the work that has said that COVID-19 comes from 5G towers, that it comes from snakes, that it comes from outer space, all those claims were made in peer-reviewed journal articles. So I think one of the things that preprints do is ask us to think carefully about, you know, what is in this, you know, what is in this paper, and do I trust it, and why do I trust it? And the preprint has a big sign at the top saying, this might all be wrong. Bear in mind, it might all be wrong. That we have that on every paper on bioRxiv and medRxiv. So a journalist needs to think about that. And I think journalists have actually, you know, good journalists like Carl Zimmer and Paul Rowe of the New York Times have been great at covering work like this, saying it has yet to undergo peer review. But I think preprints really shine a light on the fact, what about all this other work that purports to be peer reviewed and it isn't? And so I think that's kind of where I was going with that last slide about signals of trust, thinking that we need to have things that are more multi-dimensional and evolve over time. But I think it's a good point, and I have to say I have been very encouraged during COVID-19 that responsible journalists have, like the BBC, like New York Times, have been saying this work has yet to be peer reviewed, and COVID-19 is really making us think very differently about this, because the speed of the research that's happening is just, it's not compatible with waiting for 8 or 9 months to read the paper or more.
Thanks, Richard. We have a couple of more great questions if you have time. Can you hang around for another couple minutes?
Sure.
Great. So right now we have a question or two from audience member Sarvenaz. Sarvenaz, are you there? Would you like to ask?
Yes. Thank you for the great talk. I just was wondering if you have seen other positive aspects of preprints. So this would be if the public is interacting with preprints pre-COVID, are private citizens reading our work, and how it's different this year. And second, have or will preprints increase funding for science because they're increasing public awareness, and can we have more donors for research?
I suppose the quick answer to the second question was I don't know. I would hope so. I mean, it's difficult. I think the science has been under the spotlight a lot because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think medRxiv has helped significantly, but I think everybody's very much aware of this, and I'm certainly hopeful that this does increase trust in science. What was I wasn't quite sure what your first question was about. Can you say that again?
So I was wondering if bioRxiv or medRxiv track reading from private citizens or non-scientists.
No, so we don't track it. Yeah, we don't track people, and it'd be hard to know how that was the case without really following people in a way we probably wouldn't want to. But I guess what I can say is that that we had the paper that showed how long COVID-19 survived on various different very different surfaces, and that paper was downloaded 1 million times. So I think we can infer from those numbers that it wasn't just scientists, because it's very rare for a scientific article to be downloaded that many times. So I think people are, and I think that gets to the issue of trust, and also underscores the reason why we don't want to post anything that could be a public health risk, because there will be other people who will be reading these things. So we want to have clear signaling that it hasn't been peer reviewed, it hasn't been vetted. Everything on medRxiv says this should not be used to drive clinical practice. It's primarily for experts, but I think it does point to the fact we need emerging trust signals around scientific information that probably aren't as binary as peer reviewed or not peer reviewed, given the existence of so many predatory journals and articles in a lot of journals that everybody knows 2 or 3 years later aren't correct, regardless of whether they've been retracted or not.
So Richard, we have a couple of good questions from audience member Arthur Zhao. Arthur, are you there? You want to ask your questions?
Yes, I'm here. Hi, Richard.
Hi.
So I was wondering how much of the scientific community are using archive service at this moment in recent years, right? So in other words, if I only read papers from archive, am I missing out? Are there people who don't care or don't put their papers on archive?
I think
a related question. Can you speculate if it's more or less likely once a manuscript being put on archive, it will be accepted by a journal?
Okay, so to answer the first question, what's interesting, this happened exactly the same thing happened with arXiv and bioRxiv, is that you see waves of adoption in different disciplines. So what happened with arXiv when it launched in 1991 was at first it was just high energy physicists used it. And a lot of people said, oh, you know, it's just high energy physics is weird. It works for them. It's not going to work for anyone else. You know, this is just an aberration for this weird big teams. But then actually what happened was the condensed matter physicists and the experimental physicists saw what was going on and said, oh, that makes sense. And you've got these waves of adoption. So the arXiv growth curve is shows that being dominated by high energy physics initially, and then as you go through time, it represents a smaller relative number, but a higher absolute number. And we've seen the same thing on bioRxiv. Initially, in 2013, when we launched, it was bioinformatics, genomics. Bear in mind, a lot of people coming in from physics and maths into those fields were familiar with arXiv. So you saw that was the first wave. Then there was a wave, then we've seen a growing number of neuroscientists, cell biologists getting on board. They came a bit later, 2 or 3 years later, learned about it. And so it's growing, but there's still definitely areas that are less familiar with the approach. And I think it will just take time. One of the things that Paul Ginsberg, who founded arXiv, says is that nobody ever goes back. Once this subdiscipline starts posting preprints, they never change their mind and stop. Every discipline that has started doing this has continued to and to grow. So there's still various ways. I mean, it's not like we've had giant marketing campaigns for this. So I think there's more we need to do on that front. So your point about whether or not it makes the paper more likely to be accepted, it's hard to know because, you know, how do you do the case control comparison? But there's definitely lots of examples of people posting. This happened almost immediately after we launched bioRxiv. You'd have a situation where somebody would post a preprint and then they'd say, I just got emailed by an editor from Nature saying they liked my paper and they're interested in it. So, you know, I mean, I showed in one of those slides the notion of exposure, getting your work out there. One of the things you're doing, getting your work out there so it can be seen by journal editors. And there are lots of cases where that has happened. And there's also some kind of intriguing data that suggests if you post a preprint, definitely more people end up reading the article in total, and it might even be cited more. I mean, the data are a little bit earlier, but you know, you essentially get 2 bites at the cherry. So I think in that case, it would, you know, it's an opportunity to get the eyes of editors. It's also an opportunity to have the paper improved. So I think I've shown a tweet from Sri Kazuri when he was at UCSF talking about how much better the paper was as a consequence of the feedback it got from the preprint. And so that then they went to, I don't know which journal they went to, he said it sailed through because they basically find out all the kinks by the time it got to the journal.
So Richard, one last question and then we'll close it out. Is it possible to deposit already published articles into bioRxiv or medRxiv to make them more accessible?
No, so I mean, we've always avoided mission creep. What we want bioRxiv and medRxiv to be is a place is to really encourage people to disseminate work early. And so what we didn't want was a situation where people would go to bioRxiv and medRxiv and find a whole bunch of articles that they already knew about and they were old and had already been published. And it's worth pointing out that there are a bunch of institutional repositories and other services that do that sort of green open access route to making stuff available. I guess what I would say is, you know, if you want to make your paper free to someone, then just post it on bioRxiv first. You know, what we didn't want to do is have a bunch of post prints rather than preprints. So if the motivation is to make it free, by all means make it free, but make it free earlier on. And that's really our mission, is to speed up science through early dissemination.
That makes sense. Thank you. So I appreciate you hanging on for continued discussion. I want to once again thank both you and Bo for the fantastic talks today and the great discussion. We really enjoyed it. I want to thank the audience for joining us today and asking such great questions. And I want to tell you that if you did not get your questions answered, you can head over to our Slack community. I put a link in the chat box and you can ask your questions. Both Bo and Richard promised that they would head over there after the seminar to answer any extra questions. So don't forget to join us again next week. As Ron mentioned at the beginning, we will start 30 minutes earlier next week, and our guest is the University of Buenos Aires in CONICET, with speakers Gabriel Rabinovich and Rolando Gonzalez Jose. So we'll see you next week. Thanks, everyone.